The town of St. Inez, Virginia, wasn't known for mystery. It was known for church bells, harvest fairs, and oak-lined streets where folks nodded at each other like clockwork. But in the autumn of 1986, that rhythm broke forever. On the morning of October 12th, parishioners arrived at the modest, white stone Holy Mercy Church to find the doors locked. That had never happened. Father Thomas Ainsley and Sister Miriam Bell were the first to arrive every Sunday, without fail. But that morning, no candles were lit. No hymns drifted from the chapel. The altar lay cold, untouched. Sheriff Dalton was called. They found both cars parked out back. Miriam's rosary was still on her cot. Father Thomas's Bible lay open to Psalms on his desk, and the last entry in the church logbook was signed 9:13 p.m. the night before. Then nothing. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no letters, no blood, just absence. In a town where everyone knew everyone, two people had vanished from holy ground, and no one saw a thing. The story made regional news. There were whispers of foul play, of forbidden love, of divine retribution. Over time, whispers faded into rumor, then into legend. Holy Mercy stayed open another 5 years, led by fill-in clergy. But attendance dropped. The mystery stained everything. By 1992, the church was shut down and padlocked. It sat sealed and silent for decades, a relic of unanswered questions. Until 30 years later, when a new woman arrived in St. Inez. Her name was Rachel Ainsley, 32, a researcher and archivist for the Catholic Diocese. But she didn't tell anyone that Father Thomas Ainsley was her grandfather. Not yet. Rachel stepped out of her rented sedan on a gray October morning in 2016 and stared at the faded cross atop the boarded steeple. Moss climbed the stone walls. Ivy curled along the iron gates. The place looked less like a house of God and more like a forgotten mausoleum. Inside, dust danced in the pale light leaking through cracks stained glass. Pews lay crooked from warped floorboards. Cobwebs wove curtains around the pulpit. It smelled like paper rot and memories. She moved quietly, reverently, her boots clicking on old tile. In her hand was a scanned map of the original church layout, dated 1954. She traced her fingers along the altar rail, pausing at the pulpit where her grandfather had once stood. The room whispered something she couldn't quite hear. Rachel had come under the pretense of assessing historical preservation needs. But her true motive was deeply personal. She needed answers. Her father had never spoken about the disappearance. He was just 12 when Thomas vanished. Raised by his mother in the church, he'd grown distant, angry, and eventually estranged. Rachel hadn't spoken to him in years. But after his death last spring, while cleaning out his home, she found a box. Inside it, a letter from Sister Miriam to Father Thomas, written 3 days before they vanished. I fear the whispers are true. Someone knows about the books in the cellar. I'll meet you in the sanctuary after Compline. We'll decide together. Books in the cellar? What cellar? Rachel's map showed no cellar beneath the church, just crawl space. But that phrase haunted her. Someone knows. Who? And what had been hidden? She spent the first day photographing every corner of the church. Floorboards, walls. She took samples of the chipped plaster. Marked temperature drops. She noted a strange dip in the center aisle, almost imperceptible to the eye, but felt clearly underfoot. And the altar base, though fixed to the floor, had a hairline seam running around its edge. That night, Rachel stayed in the town's only inn. Her room faced the church steeple. At 3:07 a.m., she awoke gasping, a dream fading fast. Only one detail remained. She'd heard a voice say, "They never left." The next morning, she returned to the church with a crowbar and flashlight, tools she'd never expected to use in her line of work. It was under the altar that she found it, a hollow thud where there should have been solid stone. She pried loose a warped floorboard and uncovered concrete, newer than the surrounding tile. Embedded in the slab was a metal ring. She gripped it, heart pounding, and pulled. The slab lifted with surprising ease, revealing a dark hole. Cold air rushed up, damp and metallic. A rusted ladder descended into blackness. Rachel lowered the flashlight. Her breath caught. Stairs, stone stairs, leading deep under the church. She hesitated only a moment before descending. The air changed, colder, denser. The beam of her light trembled as she stepped onto the stone floor below. The walls were carved earth, reinforced with timber. A tunnel. not part of any official blueprint. 15 steps in, she found something that made her freeze. A wooden door, painted white, faint letters carved across the top. Sanctuary of the Hidden Word. Rachel reached out and touched the handle. Ice cold. And just before she could turn it, she heard something. From the other side of the door.
A voice. A whisper.
Calling her name. Rachel's hand froze on the door handle. Her breath came shallow as the voice echoed again. Quiet, almost soothing. Rachel. It wasn't possible. No one knew she was here. The church was padlocked. The town barely knew her name. She drew back, stumbling a step, the flashlight beam jittering along the walls. Her mind raced. Maybe it was wind or the shifting old timbers. But then it came again, clearer. Not shouted, not moaned, whispered, familiar. She steadied herself, pressed her ear against the door. Silence. Gathering her courage, Rachel twisted the handle. It creaked but didn't resist. The door opened into a narrow chamber, no more than 10 feet wide. The stone walls were lined with wooden shelves, each stacked with worn leather books and faded scrolls. The smell of old parchment and damp earth filled the space. She stepped inside, sweeping her light across the room. At the far end, beneath an arched alcove, stood a stone lectern. On it sat a single dust-covered book, open to the middle. Rachel approached slowly, drawn to the centerpiece. The pages were handwritten, delicate script curling across the yellowed paper. Sanctuary of the Hidden Word, Volume 9. She flipped back to the first page. The author's name stopped her cold. Thomas Ainsley, her grandfather. She scanned a few lines. We are not meant to speak of what lies below, but silence breeds rot. If anything happens to me or Miriam, this record must survive. Rachel's hands trembled. This was no church ledger. This was a confession. Footsteps echoed in the tunnel behind her. She snapped the book shut, doused the flashlight, and held her breath. A faint glow flickered outside the chamber. Someone else was in the tunnel. She pressed against the stone wall, heart pounding in her throat. A silhouette passed the open door, then stopped. Who's there? A man's voice called. Low, measured, confident. Rachel didn't move. The man stepped into the doorway. His face was partially illuminated by the dim flashlight he carried. He was in his late 50s, tall with deep creases around his eyes. Clean cut, sharp jaw. He didn't look surprised to find someone here. You shouldn't be down here, he said. Rachel didn't answer. He stepped closer. This section of the church is sealed off, for safety. I'm with the diocese, Rachel finally said, standing straighter. I'm surveying for restoration. Who are you? He paused a beat. I'm Deacon Mark Roan, caretaker of the property. That name wasn't in any of the files. I wasn't told anyone had keys, she said carefully. I volunteered to watch over what's the site after Father Joseph passed, he said. Few know the church still has a caretaker. Rachel's eyes flicked to the shelves behind her, then to the hidden book now tucked under her coat. Did you hear someone whispering? She asked suddenly. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. Whispering? I heard someone say my name. He stepped further into the room, scanning the shelves with mild interest. You've been breathing stale air. This place messes with your head if you stay too long. She didn't trust him. I should go, she said, brushing past him. Mark didn't move to stop her. Be careful, miss. Places like this hold memories. Some are better left buried. Back in the daylight, Rachel drove straight to the Diocesan Records building 2 towns over and requested full archival files on Deacon Mark Roan. The clerk typed quickly, then frowned. There's no listing for a Mark Roan. What about Father Joseph, the one who supposedly appointed him? She paused, then nodded. Father Joseph Collins passed in 2008. No mention of any transfer of caretaking responsibility, and no authorization on record for underground structures. Rachel's mouth went dry. Back at her motel that night, she opened the stolen book and read. In 1986, Miriam found the staircase beneath the altar. We'd never known it was there. It wasn't on the blueprints. She believed it was built by the original founders. But we both felt it. Something wasn't right. The books down here weren't scriptures. They were rituals. Writings in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, but twisted. She said they reminded her of the Apocrypha, but darker. And the voices, we both heard them, calling us, using our names. Rachel closed the book, chills crawling over her spine. The voices were real, just like her grandfather had written. 2 days later, Rachel visited the town's library for historical zoning maps. In an old microfilm archive from 1948, she found something startling. The original Holy Mercy Church had been built atop land previously owned by a Civil War-era sect known as the Black Veil Communion, an obscure excommunicated offshoot of Catholicism known for its hidden catacombs and unorthodox doctrines. Multiple land survey reports between 1890 and 1930 referenced sealed foundations and subterranean chambers to be avoided beneath the plot. Holy Mercy had been built directly over it. Someone had buried a forbidden faith under a house of worship, and someone had never stopped guarding it. Rachel drove back to the church at dusk, unable to stay away. The stolen book lay on the passenger seat, wrapped in an old sweatshirt. As she pulled into the gravel lot, her headlights caught movement. Someone was walking out the church's side door. It was Deacon Mark. He was carrying a shovel, and behind him, dragging slightly in the dirt, was a heavy black trash bag. Rachel killed the headlights and reached for her phone. Rachel kept low behind the rusted fence bordering the side lot. Deacon Mark paused at the edge of the woods behind the church, shovel in one hand, the heavy black trash bag dragging behind him. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows over the cracked stone path that led into the trees. Rachel's heart pounded as she raised her phone and snapped a photo. The shutter sound was silent, but her body buzzed with dread. She had no idea what was inside the bag, but the way Mark glanced over his shoulder twice told her everything she needed to know. She followed him. Staying in the dark, Rachel crept through the overgrown path that led toward the old cemetery behind Holy Mercy. Tombstones leaned like crooked teeth. Some were weather-worn to illegibility. Others bore dates back to the 1800s. Mark stopped beside a collapsed mausoleum wall, the name Bennett barely visible in the stone. He looked around one more time, then began digging methodically, rhythmically, like a man who had done this before. Rachel hid behind a weeping willow, watching through the strands of its vines. He dug about 3 feet deep, then rolled the bag into the pit with a dull thump. It was solid, heavy, too heavy for garbage. Mark quickly refilled the hole, packing the earth down with practiced stomps. Then he placed a few broken stones atop it and stepped back, wiping his brow. Only then did Rachel realize this wasn't his first grave. She waited until he disappeared back into the trees before she crept forward, hands trembling. Her phone camera's flash was off, but she took photos of the disturbed earth, the broken headstones, the half-covered initials on the nearest slab. Then she retreated. Back at the motel, Rachel transferred the photos to her laptop. One image made her freeze. On the broken marker near the gravesite, the name Miriam B. was still barely visible beneath the moss. Sister Miriam Bell had never received a funeral. Her body had never been found. Officially, she was still listed as missing. Rachel swallowed hard. The bag hadn't been trash. Mark had just buried remains. She called the sheriff's department at 2:13 a.m., her voice steady but cold. There's something buried behind Holy Mercy Church. I have photos. I believe it may be human remains. By morning, crime scene tape ringed the cemetery. Deputies in khaki uniforms combed the grass with cadaver dogs and metal probes. The scent of fresh-turned earth had drawn their attention immediately. By noon, a team had unearthed the site and opened the bag. Bones, human, partial, wrapped in a decaying nun's habit. A rosary, partially melted, lay tangled in the remains. Rachel stood beside Detective Lena Brooks, the lead investigator. Brooks was mid-40s, short auburn hair tucked behind one ear, and eyes like weathered steel. She didn't say much, but she missed nothing. You say you followed the man who buried this? Rachel nodded. Mark Roan. Says he's a caretaker, but there's no record of him. He found me inside the underground tunnel 2 nights ago. Brooks's brow furrowed. You go back in? Rachel hesitated. No, not yet. Brooks glanced toward the church. We've got a forensic team heading down now. You said your grandfather disappeared here? Father Thomas Ainsley. He vanished the same night as Sister Miriam, 1986. You think he's down there? Rachel didn't answer. That evening, police excavated under the altar. The entrance Rachel had found was now officially part of an active crime scene. The hidden chamber was sealed off and cataloged. Evidence markers lined the bookshelf she'd discovered. The book with her grandfather's name gone, confiscated. She didn't tell them she'd made copies of every page. What the police hadn't yet found was the second tunnel one she'd noticed mentioned cryptically in a marginal note in the manuscript. We followed the whispers beyond the sanctuary of the word. There's a door carved in bone, sealed with ash. Miriam believed it led to the original sanctum before the diocese came. Rachel couldn't sleep. At 2:41 a.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was whispering, ragged, breathy. Rachel, it's not over. You need to finish what they started, before he does. Click. Deadline. She stared at the phone in the silence of the motel room, breath caught in her chest. She knew who had called, and she was sure of one thing now. Her grandfather was still alive. The next day, Rachel returned to the church alone. The officers were gone. Crime tape fluttered in the wind. The entry beneath the altar had been padlocked, but Rachel still had the original keys. She slipped inside unnoticed. The tunnel was colder this time, the air more stagnant. A faint buzzing filled her ears as she moved deeper into the catacomb. At the edge of the sanctuary of the hidden word, she stopped. Something had changed. The back wall now revealed a narrow slit in the stone, like a poorly filled crevice. Rachel pressed her palm against it and felt movement air, barely perceptible. She pushed. The stone groaned, then opened. A second passage. The walls of this one were lined in strange carvings, Latin phrases, symbols she didn't recognize, childlike etchings of faces with no mouths. It descended steeply. At the bottom, a heavy wooden door. Rachel pushed it open. The chamber beyond was circular, like a baptismal rotunda. In the center stood a stone table. Around it, 8 chairs. Carved initials marked each seat. A faint trail of ash ringed the perimeter. And at the far side of the room, a small cot. A man sat on it. White hair, beard down to his chest. Thin frame wrapped in priest's robes turned gray from dust. His eyes flicked up as she entered. Rachel's voice cracked. "Grandpa?" The man stood slowly and smiled. "I knew you'd come." Rachel's knees buckled. She hadn't seen her grandfather since she was 2. "Grandpa, is it really?" He raised a frail hand. "Not here. We don't speak names in this place." His voice was gravelly, worn thin by time and solitude. But it held the same cadence as the sermons she'd listened to on grainy cassette tapes saved by her father, long after hope had faded. Rachel stepped closer, stunned by the clarity in his blue eyes. He didn't seem surprised to see her, more like he'd been waiting. "They buried Miriam behind the church," she whispered. "He did it, Mark Roan. He's involved in all this." Thomas Ainsley nodded, slow and sad. "They were going to kill her. She knew too much. When she tried to leave, they made her disappear." "They?" Rachel asked. "Who are they?" He looked toward the wall, where faded symbols flickered in the beam of her flashlight. "There were 8 of us," he said. "A council sworn to protect what we called the communion of the hidden word. It started innocently. Theological curiosity, old texts, banned gospels. But the deeper we went, the more twisted it became. The catacombs, these chambers, they were here long before Holy Mercy, built by a forgotten order." He motioned to the circle of chairs. "We held ceremonies, recited forgotten prayers, until one of us, Brother Josiah, claimed to have heard the voice of God." Rachel's pulse quickened. "He said we weren't supposed to wait for the second coming. We were supposed to create it, through sacrifice." Thomas's voice broke. "When Miriam found the hidden room, the one you discovered, she found the volumes, instructions, rites, rituals, and she found the list names of children from the congregation, schedules for surveillance. Josiah had written them in his own hand." Rachel gasped. "Are you saying this was abuse?" "Worse," he said. "They believed they were preparing vessels for divine inheritance. They called it purification by silence. They mutilated innocence, in God's name." Thomas turned, tears welling in his eyes. "I tried to stop them. I thought if I went along, I could gather evidence, bring it to the bishop. But they were always one step ahead." "What happened the night you disappeared?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "They drugged me, took Miriam away first. I never saw her again. They locked me in here, sealed the door, said I would die as a martyr to silence." He looked down at his bony hands. "But I didn't die. I kept breathing, and I kept writing. I documented every word." He pointed toward a rusted trunk near the cot. Rachel opened it, stacked journals, each marked with dates from 1986 to 2016. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages drawings of the underground layout. Records of conversations overheard through ventilation grates, names of clergymen, deacons, and even town officials involved. "They've kept it alive," he said. "Roan, he was one of the original 8. Now they're fewer but more desperate. They know someone's close. That's why he's bearing evidence. That's why they're watching you." Rachel backed away. "We need to get out of here. Now. You can testify. You can bring them down. Thomas stood slowly, wincing. My legs are weak. Help me. Rachel supported him as they climbed the stairs slowly, her mind racing. Every word he said filled in gaps she'd been chasing for years, and now she had proof. When they emerged from the tunnel beneath the altar, it was nearly dawn. The church was silent, too silent. Rachel froze when she saw it. The front doors were open. They'd been locked. She guided Thomas into the shadows behind the pews. A voice rang out. I told you to leave this alone. Mark Roan stood in the center aisle, flashlight in one hand, a silver revolver in the other. Thomas exhaled. Josiah is dead. You don't have to carry this sickness. Roan's eyes were hollow. It's not sickness, it's design. We were chosen. No, Rachel said, stepping in front of her grandfather. You chose this. You chose to bury a woman alive. You chose to lock away a man who tried to stop you. And now you're going to prison. Roan raised the gun. You won't make it to the station. Rachel's hand went to her coat pocket where her phone still recorded. Already did. Your voice is on tape. The grave is dug up. The police have the bag. It's over. For a moment, the air held still. Then Roan's shoulders sagged. The gun dipped. I tried to stop the rot, he whispered, but it always comes back. The hidden word. It always returns. He lifted the gun again, not at Rachel but at himself. Before she could shout, he pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the empty church. Birds scattered outside. Dust fell from the rafters. Roan collapsed in the aisle dead. Rachel stood frozen, breath ragged, ears ringing. Her grandfather touched her shoulder. It's done, he said, but the truth has to come out. By sunrise, the church was sealed again this time, by the FBI. Evidence teams combed the underground sanctums. The journals were scanned and authenticated. Rachel gave her full recorded statement. The remains behind the mausoleum were confirmed as Sister Miriam. 7 more bodies were found beneath the church. Children, all under 12, all missing from neighboring parishes in the 70s and 80s. By noon, national media swarmed St. Inez. Rachel sat beside her grandfather in a mobile medical unit. He was wrapped in a thermal blanket, sipping water. They'll need time, she said softly, to understand what really happened here. Thomas looked toward the shattered stained glass. They'll never fully understand, but they'll know we tried. The following week passed like a storm. Federal agents swept through St. Inez with search warrants and silence. Churches across 3 counties were investigated. Retired priests were questioned. Names in the journals Rachel's grandfather had written were matched to sealed abuse reports, long buried under diocesan bureaucracy. Of the 8 original members of the secret order, only 3 were still alive. Mark Roan was dead. 2 others died in the early 2000s under suspicious but unproven circumstances.